Our topic today is fundraising for cannabis businesses operating under social equity licenses. My name is Paula Collins. I am an attorney and an enrolled agent. I'm a member of the International Cannabis Bar Association, and I'm on the Social Equity and Diversity Committee. I'm also a member of DOPE CFO, which is the premier accounting and tax program for professionals operating in the cannabis space. I'm also on the board of Elevate Northeast, which is an education and advocacy organization based in Boston. And I've been a cannabis industry professional since 2015. I mentioned a lot of organizations. Here are their logos. I have been in cannabis since 2015, and at that time I was operating under the Morton Street Group as my name. Here you have my contact information. Hint, I respond really quickly to texts. So send me a text at 646-467-4646, or else check out my websites, paulacollinslaw.com or themortonstreetgroup.com. My target audience for this presentation, cannabis business owners, yay, who have earned a social equity license, or if you think you are in serious consideration for a cannabis social equity license. This presentation is designed with you in mind. Investors in cannabis businesses operating under a social equity license, or attorneys and accountants who are advising cannabis business owners operating under a social equity license. Some numbers. I came from accounting and tax, so you know I've got to do my numbers. 1619, that's the big number for you to know, because in 1619, that year was the first year that we know that humans were rounded up village by village and stuffed into cargo ships and shipped across the world, really, to land in what eventually became the United States. We weren't the United States then, but it was largely as a result of that trade in human life that the United States was able to become a country. It's estimated that 4.4 million people were enslaved. Now I say people, really, we don't know how many women and children were enslaved, and that's a very rough estimate, 4.4 million. Nobody really knows. Millions of people, human lives were enslaved. That's a very dark part of our past with regard to people of color from largely Afro-Caribbean nations. 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act codified, in other words, set into law, discrimination against people from China, who really had helped us with westward expansion to build the railroad, establish businesses, establish a viable means that we could build our country. And I also add here the number 1974. That is the year that Congress passed the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. That is important because before that, women could not have credit cards. Think about that. If you're a woman of color, it was a double whammy. Now, a huge gap still exists in our society in 2021, largely divided by race and gender. And those gaps are really very evident in the areas of cash, credit, and access to mentoring or modeling for what does it look like to operate a business or to build generational wealth. With the social equity license, municipalities and state governments sought to really correct some of those wrongs. However, there are still some huge issues. If you take a look at the structure of a regular cannabis business, where really if that primary license holder wanted to give away all of the equity in the business, they could bring in as many investors at whatever dollar amount they wanted. But with a social equity license, depending on the municipality, you're limited because that primary license holder must hold anywhere from 51% of the equity all the way up to, in some cases, 90% of the equity. I've shown here that some of the slots for those equity positions cannot be sold away. They cannot be occupied by people putting more money into the business. They can only be occupied by the original primary equity holders. And the equity investors then have only two, or I have one slot that has three, it might be a third slot depending on the municipality, where somebody could come in and invest and take equity in the business. So right away, that social equity business is limited as to how much money can be put into it from others. So the challenge for a cannabis business owner operating under a social equity license is threefold. First, they've got to locate investors. They've got to maximize those investment positions, and then they have to maintain compliance. So there's a term that you'll hear when we talk about equity, and that is dilution. If I give away more of my equity, am I diluting, am I watering down the equity position that those original equity holders had? And a social equity accountant or somebody who's working on the accounting for a social equity business has to always be watching for dilution. That's where the accountants and the lawyers are asked to provide solutions. You could start with Reg D crowdfunding, which sounds like a good idea. I'm talking about things that are GoFundMe or Mainvest, and there are some big differences between those two companies that I just mentioned. Sounds like a great idea, and it is successful for some entrepreneurs. I mean, you hear of some people really launching fantastic businesses from those crowdfunding platforms. However, ultimately, success on those platforms requires that you have a network of people in your orbit that you can send a link to or send an email and say, hey, I'm launching this business. Would you please put some money there? And if you don't know those kinds of people, your crowdfunding numbers are not going to go up, up, up like you see some of the projects do. So it's not necessarily a good option for social equity projects. The next would be convertible notes, debt that is, this is common in corporate environments. Now, a convertible note is kind of like a loan that can then change to an equity position. Again, watch out, because you can't give away too much of your equity. You've got to always maintain those positions to remain compliant with your state or municipal government. But it does include an interest rate and a maturity date. Now, in the cannabis space, these are usually unregulated. The SEC is not looking over your shoulder. You don't have to send in any documentation to get these approved by the SEC, but you do need to know that they will result in a payout or possibly conversion to equity. A simple agreement for future equity, that's the SAFE, much more flexible than convertible notes or equity shares, because there isn't really a maturity date. They could be used to level the equity positions in the future. Like if you got your license and your municipality allows you to, after a certain number of years, dilute some of those equity positions. This would be a good tool to use because you could get the money now for the future equity position. There's another tool called KISS. And yes, I did say KISS. I started to put some big lips there on the screen, but I thought it might be distracting. Keep it simple securities. Now, these are often used at very, very early stage when you don't even have enough money to go out and make money. And it usually means that there's what we call an MFN clause, most favored nation. That doesn't mean that we're diplomats. It does mean that we are looking for a way to give investors the right of first refusal as the business grows and as we open up share positions. So again, you have to watch your equity, that it does not get diluted. This came to us from a startup accelerator called 500 Startups. Let's get back to the safes. Now, how do they really work? And the safes are going to work very much like the KISS. So I should actually have put KISS up there also. For a very small equity position, the investor gets a big payout later on. And usually that later on results in a huge change in the structure of the business. It could even mean that we're closing that business and opening a different business, or it could mean that we're going to completely change our board of directors and all of our equity positions. Now, you might think this is kind of messed up because that 49% equity is a smaller payout. But here's the reason. If I invest $1 million for 50% equity, that's a $2 million company. But if I invest $1 million for only 5% equity, that means somebody else out there is going to invest the other 19 million, usually several somebody else's, to make up the other 95% of equity. and overall that company is worth $20 million. So you see the smaller equity position gets the bigger payout because you're really investing in a bigger project. Again, remember, these are terminating events for the company or changing dramatically the structure of the business, but it's a good way to get your business going. You're going to find that as a cannabis business owner, you're on a perpetual search to determine the proper percentage of profits, also liabilities, voting rights, positions on board of managers, and the enduring quality of the business. Ultimately, we want you to have generational wealth that could be passed on through your family or that could be sold. I want to close with one more number, and it's a serious number, and this is especially aimed at accountants and lawyers in the cannabis industry. You're going to be approached by people who would like some advice on these social equity licenses. And if your client services coordinator is programmed or scripted to turn away anybody on the phone that calls and says, well, I have this small business, and they say, well, is it less than $5 million? Well, yes, it's less than $5 million. Click, thank you very, very much. Good luck with your life. I want you to pause, and I want you to learn this number, 9 minutes and 29 seconds. That's how long George Floyd was restrained in police custody before he died. What we're trying to do here is something different in business that impacts on our society. And the accountants and lawyers have the ability to do that. If you could pause and take less than 10 minutes of your day to talk with somebody who's trying to get one of these social equity businesses going, you could really make a difference in somebody's future. You may not be able to give them the information that they need, but you may be able to refer them to somebody who can. In less than 10 minutes time, you can make a big difference in that one individual's life, in the life of that community, and in the life of the community for generations to come. It's an important number. So again, my name is Paula Collins. I operate under the Morton Street Group or under Law Office of Paula Collins. You've got my contact information. I hope I get to hear from you. Thank you.